Welcome, I'm Jeff Shapiro. I work for the Linux Foundation. I'm the license scanning manager. Today we're going to talk about open source licenses, which is not the most exciting thing compared to 3D engines and game platforms, but it is important and it is necessary. We have a pretty small group here in our live audience, and so I'm going to talk to the people on the virtual platform for a minute. I would like to get some sense of how much expertise people have in open source licenses before I begin. So if you could respond to our moderator, and then I'll ask her to let me know in just a couple minutes how much expertise we have. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly and then try to leave some time at the end to talk specifically about Open 3D Engine and answer questions if there are any. So my objective today is really to teach you about open source licenses, what they are, what they mean, and give you just a basic understanding of some of the most important aspects of why open source licenses are necessary. And a disclaimer, I'm an engineer, I'm not a lawyer. And the reason that I tell you this is because if you ask me a legal question, I can't actually give you legal advice. But as an engineer, I hope that if you have questions about why this is important for you as a developer, then I can address those. So just briefly, Wikipedia states, and I happen to like this, a license defines rights and obligations that a licensor grants to a licensee. So the licensor is typically the person who owns the copyright or is the author who wrote the code or created it. And the licensee is the user of the code. So in this context, and with most open source projects, you could be on either side of that coin. You could be a contributor, you could be a project maintainer, or you could be a downstream user, the end user who's using that project. Open source licenses grant licensees, that's the user, the right to copy, modify, and redistribute the source code. And those are important things. Without those, you can't really claim that the code is open source. And as Open 3D Engine is all about being open source and being available for everybody, that's pretty important. So rights and obligations and conditions. The rights are typically use, inspect, copy the source code, make modifications, create derivative works, redistribute. If you're mixing this with a commercial project, for example, redistribution is very important. Obligations and conditions, these are the things that you are required to do if you use the code. Provide attribution, for example, these are examples. Disclaiming warranty and liability, that's a very common one with most licenses. If you use this open source, you're using it as is, we don't give you any warranty. Let me ask the moderator briefly, did you get any feedback? None from the virtual platform. Okay, we'll continue. Thank you. Licenses are broken down into two main categories, permissive licenses and copyleft licenses. Permissive licenses generally allow you to use the code in most situations, and there are typically very few obligations. Copyleft licenses, the reason it's called copyleft is because it carries over certain attributes of the license to the code that is not the original open source, but the code that you're mixing it with. And the main objective of copyleft licenses is to ensure that the derivative work or the combination or the code that you've mixed together will remain as open source. So this typically makes it less compatible if you're developing proprietary code. There's nothing that's better or worse about permissive or copyleft. It's just important to understand the difference and which is suitable for your own application. There's also public domain, which is, there is literally no copyright. It's not actually a license, but it basically means that all copyrights have essentially been disclaimed. And there is proprietary code. There's no end to the number of proprietary licenses out there. Again, that's obviously not open source, but any commercial enterprise that's selling a product is very often selling it under a proprietary license. Most people know of these as a EULA, the things that you click on when you accept that you're using something, for example. So just some quick examples of some of the different license types. BSD, MIT, and Apache are probably the most common permissive licenses out there. And in fact, the Open3D engine is licensed under the Apache and MIT licenses. I'm going to talk about dual licenses in a few minutes. There's a distinction for copyleft licenses between what we call weak and strong copyleft. So the weak copyleft is these attributes of that license carry over only in very specific circumstances. Whereas the strong copyleft, those attributes generally carry over more universally. So again, the copyleft license typically means that my code is open source. I'm releasing it under a copyleft license. Let's choose Mozilla at random, the MPL, Mozilla Public License. If you mix my source code under that open source license with your own source code and create a combination or a derivative work, you must also release your code under the Mozilla license. Now, as a weak copyleft license, there are exceptions. For example, if it's a dynamic library and you're doing dynamic linking, then that actually doesn't apply. I'm not going to get into those specifics right now, just that there's a distinction between sort of how those licenses will apply, and we call them weak or strong based on that. It's also worth noting that most of these licenses have multiple versions for all of them. So usually I go through this license example in detail. I'm going to just very briefly say this is an example of the MIT license, and I want to point out that, so the top is, these are your rights. Permission is granted free of charge to use the software to copy, distribute, et cetera, et cetera. The obligation, the only obligation here is attribution, meaning you need to acknowledge where this code came from and not take the license or copyright information out of the source code. That's very important. And then the bottom section is the disclaimer of warranty. So I'm not going to read it at length, but go back and look at the slides later and compare it to the rights and obligations slide, and you'll see how that makes sense. It's also important to note that a copyright is not a license. A copyright exists unless something is placed into the public domain. A copyright, whether it's explicitly stated or not, is essentially you own, you're the author, or a corporation holds the copyright to the code. You get to decide how that code is licensed, or if it's licensed at all, or if it's a trade secret and nobody has the rights to do it at all. And by the way, it's worth mentioning, if you can't identify a specific license for a piece of code that you find out there, it may not even be open source at all. Just because you can see the code, that does not guarantee that it's open source. So that's really important, especially for the developers out there who like using Stack Exchange or other websites to download code snippets. Unless it specifically states it's under an open source license, be very careful, it may not be open source. I'm going to switch gears for a moment and talk about a couple things that aren't open source licenses exactly, but they are very important, very important in the context of large open source projects like Open3D engine and other open source projects. So a contributor license agreement, it defines the terms under which intellectual property, in this case typically code, is contributed to a project and what license it's contributed under. So Open3D engine, actually, I don't believe, it doesn't have a specific CLA. I'm going to get to the details about O3D later, but it does not actually have a CLA per se. It uses something different, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Many open source projects have a CLA, and it essentially says if you contribute your code, you agree to contribute under this specific license. It spells out the license that you're contributing under. So this is very important for the maintainers, for example. Make sure that all the code that comes in is now available under this license. So this is different than a CLA. So the next thing I'm going to mention is the Developer Certificate of Origin, the DCO. Open3D Engine actually does have a DCO. This was introduced by the Linux community, and it represents that you have the right to contribute the code that you are either authoring or that you get from somewhere else, that you have a right to contribute that to the project. Excuse me. It spells out that anything you're contributing was created by you, or you have the rights otherwise to submit the code. So a DCO is not a license. It is essentially a representation that you have the right to contribute the code. And it's not exactly the same as a CLA as well. The CLA is a license agreement between the contributor and the maintainers of the project, whereas the DCO is simply a statement that you are representing, you are essentially certifying that you have those rights. And as I mentioned, Open3D Engine has a DCO, does use a standard DCO. While it doesn't have a CLA, the contributor license agreement, the contributing guidelines do spell out, and I'm going to show you that if I have time at the end. It does actually spell out the licenses that you're contributing under. Another thing that I want to mention is a very important standard, SPDX, which is the Software Package Data Exchange. SPDX is much more than just licensing information. I'm not going to talk about the standard itself. That's not the purpose for me today. But one small piece of SPDX is that it has this thing called an SPDX Identifier. And that's really useful. And I noticed that Open3D Engine is using these SPDX identifiers, so hats off to you. That's important. This is essentially a small comment in the header of every single source file that is easy to see, it's easy to read by humans, and it's machine readable. And it simply tells you which license applies to this code. So in fact, as I mentioned, Open3D Engine uses the Apache 2 license and the MIT license. And I'm going to talk about dual licensing in just a moment and what that means. So you would see something similar to that second example there. It might say MIT and Apache, or it might say MIT or Apache, but it would look something like that. So it's very important for contributors and developers to use these identifiers as much as possible. Okay, I've been promising I would tell you what dual licensing means. So it's very common for a lot of projects to be under what's called a dual license, or sometimes even more. This does not mean that the code is under both, in most cases, this does not mean that the code is under both licenses at the same time. What it means is that you are licensing it under both licenses, and the user has a choice. So the downstream user, has a choice of using that code under one license or the other license. So both licenses are there in the code, in the project information, and the user gets to make the choice. So that's the most common application of a dual license. And just a couple examples, like why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just pick one license and be done with it? Well, the reason is because you may have different use cases, you may have different user bases, and you want the user to have a choice. So in the case of, I give two examples here. In the case of Perl, Perl's available under the GPL or the artistic license. And you get to decide if you are using, not just writing Perl code, but actually using the Perl code base itself. You have a choice to decide which license applies. And if you are using code under a GPL license or another copyleft license, you might choose to use that because it's more compatible. We're going to talk about license conflicts in a minute as well. The artistic license may be more compatible. Qt, I think this is a little bit better example. It's available under a GPL or a commercial license. So it's not just the choice of two open source licenses. Why would they do this? Well, Qt is a commercial company. And by the way, I know Qt is a dependency for Open3D Engine. So if you're using Open3D Engine for a commercial product and you're basing your commercial product on O3DE, this is actually pretty important for you to understand if you have Qt as a dependency for your product as well. If you plan on open sourcing your code, your project, your product downstream, then GPL may be the appropriate license for you to use overall. But if you're planning on selling it, then you're okay with Open3D Engine because it's under permissive licenses. But if you have Qt as a dependency, you might need to purchase a commercial license for Qt so that you can sell your combined work downstream, and then the GPL license doesn't apply. So if there's dual licenses, you get to choose. You may wish to consult your legal counsel if you're a commercial entity to decide which is best. But the end is that you get to choose. Okay, just very briefly about obligations. Obligations can come into play at different times. Some of them are triggered by distribution. So if you're just using the code for your own experimentation and you're never giving it to anybody, distribution may not apply. Excuse me. Integration, whether source code is mixed together, whether things are dynamically linked or actually running as a separate process, such as an operating system. Have you made any modifications? One notable exception is the AGPL. This is triggered, the obligations for AGPL, which is the Affero GPL. Won't talk about that in detail, but the obligations are present if code under the AGPL is present on your network or on your server, even when something is completely web hosted or a web service and there's no distribution. So if you find the AGPL license, you should proceed cautiously depending on your use case. License conflicts. We all want to play well together. Most licenses are compatible, but not all of them. So do they have conflicting obligations? The OSI, which is the Open Source Initiative, and the Apache Foundation, and the GNU and Free Software Foundation all have excellent references and articles talking about mixing things with different licenses and potential conflicts. Just a few examples here. I'm just going to skip over these, but just briefly, if you're mixing Apache and different versions of the GPL, they may play well or they may not. So if you have multiple licenses, especially permissive and copyleft licenses, you definitely want to check for conflicts. Mixing open source with proprietary code. This may be a very common use case with Open3D Engine. If you're using Open3D Engine, which is again is under permissive licenses, and you're mixing it with proprietary code to sell this commercially, you're generally in pretty good shape, except, as I said, be careful about the dependencies such as Qt if you're using them. Most permissive licenses play well with proprietary code. Most copyleft licenses tend to have conflicts if you're releasing code under a proprietary license. Again, it depends on how things are integrated or combined based on what I just talked about last slide. So just be careful there. So a very quick example of how open source and proprietary code play well, or play together, excuse me. The top is you have open source under a permissive license. You end up with proprietary code, you're okay. If you have a weak copyleft license and you mix it with proprietary code, you end up with this combination, depending on how things are integrated. And if at the bottom you start with a strong copyleft license, as I showed in those examples, and you mix it with proprietary code, what you end up with is open source. And if that is your intention, that's all great. But if you're planning on selling that code and it's not your intention, then you should just be careful about that and reconsider if that's the right open source for you to use. Contributions. So if you're contributing code, if you're a developer out there and you're a contributor and whether it's Open3D Engine or any other open source project, and you are contributing, you need to think about the project license. Are you okay with what the project license is? Because according to the contributor license agreement or whatever the project is using for their contribution guidelines, you still own the copyright. It's a little bit tricky when you have potentially dozens or hundreds of contributors. You're not assigning the copyright. You're not giving up your copyright to the code, but you are giving the project the right to release the code under their project license. And so this is true for Open3D Engine as well as most other large projects. You still own the copyright, but you're giving Open3D Engine the right to release your code in perpetuity forever as part of the Open3D Engine project under the Apache or MIT license. And as I mentioned, in this case, Open3D Engine uses the DCO. It says that you are representing, you're certifying that you have the right to let Open3D Engine release the code under that license. And if you wrote the code, then that's easy, because it's your decision. I wrote that code, I own the copyright, it's my decision to let Open3D Engine release it in that way. If I got the code from somewhere else, I better make sure that I have the right to contribute it to the project. Choosing a project license, you want to think about your goals. I'm gonna move a bit quickly because I want to show an example. So in this case, if you're a contributor to Open3D Engine, you're not choosing the license, it's already there. But if you're creating your own project, there are things to consider when you're choosing a project license. There are advantages to choosing a permissive license, especially if you want to play well with proprietary code or commercial companies and let them use it. Those are things to consider. Choosing a copyleft license is also a perfectly good option. It depends on your use case and where you want the code to go in the future. These are some resources. I'm going to take this away for just a moment and okay. I'm going to mirror my display so you guys can see what I want to show you. Okay, so this is probably going to be hard for you to see because it's probably pretty small. Let me see if I can, oops. So hopefully that's readable. So what we're looking at here is we are looking at the GitHub page for Open3D Engine. And what I want to show you is that on the main, at the top level of the project, there is a file called license.txt. And I don't expect you to be able to read this, but hopefully you can at least see that up there it's O3DE, and this is, as I said, this is the top level repository. And this is the Open3D Engine license, and it says the default license for Open3D Engine is the Apache license version 2.0. You may elect at your option to use the Open3D Engine under the MIT license. So that's a perfect example of a dual license. It is your choice as the downstream user to redistribute that code under either Apache or MIT. And the good news is, for most cases, those are both permissive licenses, and in most cases, it gives you very, very wide rights and abilities to use the code for just about any use case. And then the other thing I want to show you here, also at the top level, is the contributing document, which says, "Welcome to Open3D Engine," etc. Talks about making contributions. When contributing, your pull request will require you have agreed to our DCO. That DCO is the same DCO that I showed you, and there's a link to that, and a link, of course, here on that page. So Open3D Engine uses the standard DCO that represents that you have the rights to contribute the code. So they've done a great job at Open3D Engine specifying what license the code is under for downstream users and what your obligation is as a contributor in contributing code to Open3D Engine, and that you are essentially promising that you have the right to contribute that code, and you are giving, if you look at the contributor guide, it goes on to say here, again, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but it goes on to say that you are giving Open3D Engine permission to release your code under the project licenses. So just wanted to give that quick example and show you how all of these things that I just talked about actually apply to Open3D Engine. And here are some resources for some of the things that I talked about. I won't go through these things because I'm about out of time, but let me at least ask for the people here in person, or if there are any on the virtual platform, if there's any questions.
For companies that are looking to incorporate. For companies that are looking to, say, game development studios, and they want to build games using this engine, using this software, what are some of the caveats that they should be aware of, or things that they have to pay attention to if they're going to release one that will be sold out into the market?
Okay, excellent question. So Royal asked, for companies that want to use Open3D Engine and incorporate it into their products and then potentially sell that, what are some of the things that they need to be aware of? Did I get that correct? Okay, so the good news is Open3D Engine is under permissive licenses, so there's very little that you need to worry about, but you do need to acknowledge, you do need to have, there's an industry standard called a notice file, you do need to acknowledge in some way where you know, what you're using and where it came from. So you would acknowledge Open3D Engine. And then the other thing that I mentioned when I talked about Qt as an example, you need to be aware of third-party dependencies. So if Open3D Engine, you've got the source code, the open source that is out there that you can download and use. That's all under the project license. But if Open3D Engine has binary dependencies that it itself is dependent on, that you then need to have to run your application or run your product, you need to be aware of any other licenses that apply to those third-party dependencies that are not directly part of the Open3D Engine project. They're essentially a layer underneath. They're a platform, or there's some other dependency underneath that Open3D Engine depends on. And they may be under a different license. So that's the main thing you need to be aware of, is if you have those dependencies that you're also using, that Open3D Engine is using, you need to be aware of what license those dependencies have and whether they play well, or if in the case of Qt, maybe you need to buy a commercial license. So that would be the main thing you need to depend on. Okay, I'm out of town. I'm out of time. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I hope you guys found that interesting. If anybody wants to connect with me offline, feel free to do so. Thanks.